Greetings, all, and welcome to Esoteric Babble.
So when I was young and they packed me off to school, I remember at some point early on, I don't know what grade, either sixth or third or I don't know, learning about Esperanto. And I didn't learn much, but I just heard about this. And um, I've gotten interested in languages throughout the decades. And probably about 15 years ago, I came across an online course, and I did a little bit. The I think it's the Curso maybe. And then just over the summer, I took the plunge into Esperanto with Duolingo, and that has led me to a fabulous book um, called Factoi kai Fantasioi, like Facts and Fantasies by Marjorie Boulton. And I started reading Esperanto. I don't really speak it. I don't have people to speak it with yet, and I haven't. I know that there are communities online, um, and I do aspire to that. So, but in the meantime, I've been doing Duolingo. I really have enjoyed it, and amongst other books, I found my way to this book, and I really, well, I really like the book, and I just want to read a little part of it. Um, just to kind of give you an idea, the book is kind of divided into talking about um, facts and, which would be kind of like more on the scientific end, like what's the largest animal? What's the largest land animal? What's the city with the shortest name? Things like that. And then also presenting basically stories. And I would say fantasioi here, or a good way to understand that word, instead of just like facts and fantasies, but like facts and the imagination, works of the imagination. And we're going to get to that in just a second. There was something else I wanted to say, dear listener, but just to say that this book, the book itself, is really designed for people who are starting. It's sort of what they would call a graded reader. So as you read on, it gets progressively a little more difficult. But anyway, I'm going to read this. I'm going to read it just translated into English. I'll put the Esperanto up on the screen. La Esperantistoj povas kriti min. And I need all the help I can get here. But let's just go through this. It's just a little paragraph. Now, leading up to this, she's talked about how many animals, for instance, want to know, is there food? What kind of food? Is it good or bad? Where is the food? Things like that. She says that human beings, she doesn't say this, I would add ostensibly, human beings are the only animals who ask why. She puts that at the end of the list. She's saying the last correlative. Why is there food? That we know of, animals don't ask that. We don't really have access to their mental states, but this is her position. So, but then she goes on to say, even stranger and possibly more glorious than our appetite for facts is our talent for fantasies, or our talent for the, for the imaginal, maybe. Slightly loose there. We create in our mind a world which does not exist outside of our head. Fantasies console us. We imagine ourselves in more agreeable or interesting situations. But through that, like I would say, imaginal talent, people also create great works of art, epic poetry, dramas, novels, paintings, statues, symphonies, films. How mysterious and unique is the human artistic creative capability? Now I'm reading this on like a little Kindle here. I'll flash up. If I didn't already, I'll put up the cover of that book. Amazing book there. Now, one thing that I wanted to talk about here is that how she says we create in our heads or in our minds a world that doesn't exist outside of our heads. And that's really that's a really powerful statement, right? And there's a couple of things here. I keep setting this down like I'm done with it, but I'm not. So I want to make sure I talk about that, and I want to make sure that we touch on something. Is she says that we have like an appetite for the imaginal, but and we do. But I think that the what not being a neuroscientist, I think the consensus is that our brain, or at least part of our brain, a certain hemisphere of our brain, just does that. A certain part of our brain creates narratives. It explores the world through what we might call imagination. And it's not like this is something that is an extra, and it's something that we can at times, do or not do. Like, we are constantly doing it. And that leads me to this other great sentence of hers, or statement, that we create a world, or even worlds, in our mind that don't exist outside of our heads. But here's the question. How do we know that any world we create in our mind exists outside of that mind? Now, I clearly am not the first person to have asked this question, obviously, and probably we've all thought about this at some point in time. So, there obviously have been answers to this throughout history, and I would say that I like it in a very simplistic way. I haven't dealt with Kant in a long time, right? But my understanding of Kant is that Kant realized that we have this sensorial apparatus, and we have these external stimuli, and that we create as best we can, or we create. And I think I heard Noam Chomsky say that the stimuli are the occasion for, creating. We build up a picture of the world based upon our sight and sounds and odors and tastes and feelings, and not to mention that what our mind then can put together, and that world, that picture, is the phenomenal world. There is sort of, maybe metaphorical, or however you want to look at it, beyond that or behind that world, the noumenal. There's actually the things in themselves that we just don't have access to. We don't have direct access to anything. Everything is mediated to us through our senses. We don't experience things immediately. We experience them mediately through the medium of our senses. And so we don't know if the world really exists out there the way we see it. And actually, I would say that most of us would, on some level, agree that the world that we see, it isn't the world the way it is. Now, I know that there are some people who are have some take issue with that, and probably entrenched dogmatically in certain positions, but do we really think an ant or a fly sees the world the same way we do? An amoeba, a dog, a cat, when you think about what kind of world or environment would we find ourselves in if our sense of smell was kind of just as strong as our sense of sight and sound? Like if we could build up a picture of reality like that. I mean, I think the human being sense of smell is pretty weak compared to other animals. Um, Obviously, there are different wavelengths of light that much smaller eyes are going to see, and a bigger eye would see differently. A bird flying around, or even a nocturnal bird like an owl, would see something, just perceive the world very differently than we do. So that's just one thing I wanted to kind of start with, because I think it's a really interesting point, and it's certainly an interesting point when we are engaged in something like the practice of Buddhism, for several reasons. One is that the one teaching of the Buddhas is, like, say, the three characteristic marks of existence, is that we start to realize the impermanence of things, that things contain like a baseline suckiness, and that and really, and when I say this, the Buddha is never abstract. The Buddha is always talking about our experience. So our experience of ourselves is really not, it is just illusory. We kind of take impermanent things to be permanent. And now this gets into a little discussion of how, especially I think in the ancient world, what is real would be considered, would only be something that doesn't undergo change. Our body, everything, our bodies, our emotions, our awareness, about everything we can imagine about ourselves is constantly changing. So none of that can, quote, be real, cannot be our real self, and we shouldn't attach to it. So that's one kind of interesting thing. The second is that the Buddha, particularly in the Mula Pariyaya Sutta, urges those of us who are on or trying to implement the training not to form a lot of beliefs about the world. And actually the opposite, right, is very much, that's what someone not on the path does. Someone on the path is trying to get rid of these beliefs. And I think it's for this, I'm not going to say it's for the same reason, but you can see how if we don't really have access to the world as it is, to how can we ever really, we can't make statements about that world, at least. And we probably, the statements we make are going to be more beliefs. And the problem with beliefs is that we get real invested in them. And if they ever come into conflict with reality, usually we have to change reality. I mean, you see this all the time. I mean, a good example would be, I think, with flat earthers, but with about anyone, it's going to happen. So I think that that's sort of very important, and it can take a while for that to really sink in, how important it is not to become, not to identify with beliefs. And so what that makes me think is, rather than thinking about whether statements are true about the world, and I'm not saying that's not important, because clearly, and I'm just going to, I think it's self-evidently important that things be true. But we can also ask the question, when we get back to these imaginations, when we start like connecting the dots of all these facts and we build up stories, and we can ask how useful a certain position might be, even beyond whether we think it's true or not. And this leads me really to what, something that I was talking about with a good friend yesterday, and I hope he comes on the channel for another interview. But where do we place mind in this whole, if we form a picture at all of reality, do we think that mind gives rise to matter or that matter gives rise to mind? And for me, again, just to restate this, I think that whatever position we take, we should look at how useful it is, and versus whether we think that it's true. I'm not sure that we can ever really, like, can we actually demonstrate that the world is mental, like idealistic, or that it's material? I think that this is more philosophical and really beyond the realm of like the empirical. I personally believe even if you built something that became conscious, that wouldn't actually in any way prove that the material created the, say, consciousness, because it might just be like building a TV or radio that, that is picking up something. Now I know that that's an analogy, that's a metaphor. I've told that to people and they said, well, but what kind of wavelength? That's not what I'm saying. Just using this as we have to use our imagination a little bit. If consciousness is is fundamental, it could be that a certain arrangement of things brings that into existence. Now, I also want to say I have no idea how anything works. I really don't, and I'm not trying to advocate for anything like that. I don't know mechanisms or anything. I'm just trying to get us to hopefully have conversations about, like, what are some interesting possibilities. One thing, if we think that matter gives rise to consciousness, I do think a good thing about that is we are, and I'm not saying this is the only way, but a usefulness of that position is to say, well, hey, look, this person who had, maybe pretty far outside of the normal baseline experience of reality, it turns out when that person passed away and we examined the brain, there were some pretty big abnormalities. There were some lesions or some other things, and not only that, I think that you can get, there are obviously all kinds of things that can happen to our brain that cause us to experience reality differently. We can take certain drugs, alcohol, whatever, and our experience changes. So clearly the material plays a part. Now, again, it could be just that it's because we have some sort of filter, like maybe the brain is some kind of filter, and that this is changing those filter settings, kind of like if you have a low pass filter, if you're interested in electronic music or synthesizers at all, or even, I guess, equalization, that you can fiddle with things and get different sounds to come out. You aren't producing the sound, you are filtering it, right? You're manipulating, but really just kind of maybe accenting or emphasizing and de-emphasizing parts. So it could just be that that's what's going on there. Now, I think connected to what's useful, to me, the problem with, and again, this doesn't mean that it isn't true, obviously, but the problem with thinking that material or that matter or that the physical gives rise to the mental, to consciousness, is that I do think in the end, I find it difficult to see how we're not just little billiard balls and that we really don't have any sort of agency. Maybe there's some way that matter gives rise to consciousness and then the consciousness can somehow overcome or change what's, the substrate. I don't really know. But in general, it seems like people who are materialists, physicalists, tend to regard consciousness as this epiphenomenon. It's just an added thing. It doesn't really count for much. It's illusory, and our free will is illusory. I don't think many people lead their lives like that. And I would also say that the Buddha and other, probably all mystical traditions, Vedanta, other, you can name many, certainly would not agree that the way we perceive things is the way they are. So that there is, there's obviously room for us being deceived and not perceiving reality or perceiving ourselves the way we really are. But I think when you go to this extreme of really saying, you're just kind of this, this meat machine, this little robot, and to me that is highly unuseful. It's very unuseful. So for me, I think that it's very interesting and just very interesting and useful to think that mind, maybe even in English a capital M, that mind creates reality, or that is somehow not obviously our individual mind, but mind, that consciousness, that some sort of mentality is the primal fundamental reality from which matter comes into existence. Now, there are other possibilities, right? There could be mind and matter. They could be two sides of one coin. This, to me, is even maybe more likely because it's something that we can't really even imagine. Like I think, I'm not sure if it's in the Mumonkan, the Zen koan, where, all things lead to the one or return to the one. To what does the one return? We can tend to simplify things to one thing. It's hard to go beyond that. And but it could be that the reality is something that's beyond what we think of as consciousness or matter. But I think this has blossomed into quite a long video, and really this is just the sort of thing that I like to sit around and have a conversation with other people, and so I'm just putting it out there. Dear listener, I would be very interested in what you have to say about all of this. So until next time, peace.